So when I think about the idea of a religious order, my mind goes to all sorts of quite mythical places. It's quite a distant and romanticised idea. I've never been in circles where that's a normal thing. My mind goes to like the characters in the Indiana Jones films who are part of a secret order who are sworn to protect this or that holy relic. So from the Protestant world, it has this kind of air of mystery. I suppose it's not centred on a building that you go to on a Sunday, is it? It's this slightly elusive network who have a shared rule and language amongst themselves. That said, I don't really know what one is. Could you just paint the picture of religious orders in the Catholic tradition? Where did they begin, and what shape do they take?
Okay, well, it's a huge question. It's probably developed within the Catholic tradition. Going back to some of the things we've touched on before, how a need for belonging, a need for family, a need for sharing, and I think in the very early church, there was a feeling that as the church began to get, as Christianity began to become a more sort of established position after Constantine, and it became part of the political as well as the religious sort of framework, there was obviously movements developed that some people said, this is selling us down the line. We need something more radical. And the early monastic movement was really a move from out of the cities into the desert. So you'd have like the desert fathers and the desert mothers. So you'd get a holy man or a holy woman who would find some sort of cave or set herself up. But then people would begin to go to visit them. So you'd get communities joining around them. So the very early stages of the monastic movement was a mixture of flight from the world, flight from the establishment aspect of the church, and looking for a more radical expression of what the faith meant. And that developed then in the centuries in many different ways, with men and women. Saint Benedict was one of the key figures in the whole monastic movement. The Benedictine order is one of the oldest, and he sort of started that particular sort of framework, and the founder would usually begin to articulate a rule, a constitution that would sort of regulate how the community developed. And they developed a lot depending on the culture where they were, in terms of how they would survive, how would they depend on money coming in as gifts from the rest of the church, or would they have some sort of a way of earning money. So, for instance, in the build-up to the Reformation in this country, a lot of the monasteries had in fact become very, very strong economic as well as political sort of focus for how the country held together. They would be big landowners, and they would also be big employers. So a lot of the sheep industry in the medieval England would have been the local monasteries that would have started that. Our own particular order came in the 18th century, so it was a later development. It was Italian in its origins, and as I tried to explain before, the essence of the spirituality was wanted a monastic context in which there would be contemplation and prayer, and the companions, the Passionists, the monks, would live in that sort of isolated place. But it was a mixture with the Passionists, because rather than becoming totally isolated, as say the Cistercians and some of the Trappists and some of the other orders are, where they remained simply in their monasteries, we Passionists saw ourselves as combining the active and the passive. So you would be living in a situation that was quite isolated. We would be following a monastic rule, so there'd be prayers at set times during the night and day. I mean, when I joined, we used to get up at 2:00 in the morning for the first set of prayers and back to bed at 3, up again at 6. And each part of the day was punctuated by everybody coming together for those prayer sessions. However, we also had the tradition that we would go out at the request of the local church to conduct what we called a mission, which would be 2 or 3 of the men would go to a parish at the invitation of the local parish and would conduct a series of sermons, devotions, prayers, would visit the people with a view to encouraging them in terms of where their faith was. So we sort of straddled both the strict monastic isolated, and the more outward going Jesuit, for instance, approach. Now there are lots of variations within that. There are lots of variation between men and women, but that's basically where the idea of a religious order came from. And I suppose it partly it goes back to our particular tradition, because we live in this a church that aspires to be universal and is quite structured. To have a bit of freedom as a family to develop in your own particular way is something worth promoting. So there are two kinds of priests, for instance. I belong to the priests who would describe themselves as religious, belonging to a religious order, whereas I had an uncle, he's died since, but he was what we'd call a secular priest, and he would belong to a diocese. So a diocese, say for instance the Liverpool Archdiocese, would be under the Archbishop in Liverpool, and he, my uncle, and others would be allocated to a parish or would be at the behest of the Archbishop. I've worked in Liverpool, but I've worked there as a Passionist. So there's a sort of a relationship where I obviously need to be in good standing with the Archbishop, but he doesn't have a direct control over what I do or where I am. So there's a freedom within certain limits as to how we develop our own particular sort of way forward. So, for instance, in Birmingham here, Martin and John, till he died, chose to go and live in Spark Hill and to share their house with asylum seekers. And that was their way of sort of walking alongside people. They would have informed the local archbishop so that he knew they were there. It was with his sort of blessing, as it were, but independently. So that's part of the sort of the general background of where a religious order comes from, and it's where that model is under pressure, not just with the Passionists, but across the field, because that way of actually working and living, both for men and women, is not necessarily the way that people today would want to actually do it. So there's big changes in terms of how the structure and development of religious life is going.
I'm just imagining an alternative history of the world where there's a Catholic order called the Lutherans.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen quite like that. I'm beginning to become aware that the idea of a religious order and a rule of life, or monasticism in some form or another, is sort of become attractive and interesting to people beyond Catholic circles, as well as within. And I think partly it might be to do with that inherent decentralizing energy that you mentioned in connection with the Desert Fathers in early Christian history. I don't know if that decentralizing energy is always necessarily a part of why religious orders begin, but I think many people are looking for questions of, well, how am I a Christian person, or someone who adopts this posture or this way? How do I do that without it being totally dictated by my interactions with the building I go to on a Sunday? How does it permeate life? How does it decentralize a bit from the oversight and authority maybe that happens with that building that I go to on a Sunday? I mean, I guess you've painted a picture where often a religious order is in a sort of healthy dialogue and a mutually enriching thing with hierarchical parts of the church. I guess obviously my mind goes to the kind of the new monasticism. I don't know how in touch with that kind of movement you've been, but there's it's an ecumenical kind of thing that's drawing on all kinds of spiritualities, but I suppose drawing more on that idea of well, it doesn't have a rule of life. It has liturgies, I suppose, and principles, but something that's a bit less dependent on the structures that have been centred really on a building that you go to on a Sunday.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think there's many examples of where that overlap or the liminality, to use another word that you've mentioned before, David, is an enrichment at the moment. I mean, paradoxically, I don't know whether you're aware, but the religious orders have often been a prophetic voice, both condemning and encouraging the larger church population. So there's lots of examples from the history of monasticism where they've stood out and been a prophetic voice, condemnation of the way that church is being led. And there's always an overlap. I mean, for instance, with the present Pope, are you aware that he's a Jesuit? So, in other words, he joined and was a Jesuit in Argentina, and then has eventually been asked to become Pope. And then he's taken the name Francis, because that's a tradition with us. And he's taken the name Francis because the Franciscans, called after Saint Francis, was very much sort of part of his own sort of spirituality in terms of where he is, in terms of the ecological thing. So you can see actually embodied in the present Pope some of those monastic spiritual sort of traditions swimming around in terms of how he operates. And I think what happens on a personal level can be replicated, as you've already indicated, with many groups that are able to pick out. And I suppose it's how do we then organise, how do we come together? So, for instance, going back to the little example I gave you, which we call the vestibule, we're an ecumenical group. Not everybody in it is a Catholic. Some people don't go to church at all. There's a commitment to how we share our lives each week and how we then have a look at perhaps what the scriptures are showing, the scripture readings for that particular Sunday. From a Catholic tradition, there's a sort of a cycle. So we just follow that cycle and have a look at it. Sometimes it links, sometimes it doesn't. And there's also a commitment to saying, well, how do we help Zakir and Sultana, who are the two asylum seekers that were presently, the Passionists are presently, and the vestibule is supporting it, in terms of how they are given space to live. So that there's the coming together of the different aspects of life. And perhaps sort of conscious of the way you were suggesting the question, perhaps that's what it's going to be in the future. There's going to be a lot more of those independent sort of groupings. And are we scared of that? Are we scared of sort of, do we have to have the big picture as being the one that calls the tune? We want to avoid a fragmentation, which sort of says everybody's in their own little unit. There's obviously risks in that. But is there a way in which we can begin to sort of meld together the larger picture within a smaller group that you're actually involved with? An interesting archaeological fact, which I didn't know, is that when an archaeologist goes into one of the ancient Christian sites, say in Turkey or somewhere like that, they've discovered that there would be, surprisingly, within a very small area, countless numbers of the remains of little churches, most of them grouped around a big one. So, for instance, in a cathedral city in England, you'd have, say, somewhere like Lincoln, for example, you'd have the main cathedral, but then you'd have all these little outposts. Now, in a sense, that seems nonsensical to say, well, why bother with all those little churches when you've got a nice big church to go to? But in a sense, it shows that there's been a shift from those little communities sort of working where they all know one another. And a friend of mine who's studied this, he would claim, he says, once a community gets to more than 20, 25, it's time for that community to go and start another community. Because once you go beyond that, of course you can have larger communities, but you're into a different ball game. So if you are trying to sort of encourage this interaction between people who know one another, there's risks in it. Of course there are. It could become introverted, it could become taken over by... It's not a fail-safe sort of way forward, but it's an interesting challenge to say that, do we exist between, on the one hand, do you vote Labour or do you vote Conservative? Who are you on the larger level and who are you on the smaller level? And perhaps that is breaking down this zigzag sort of journey that we're on, and we're having to face those sort of questions in new ways, and where's the opportunities to actually do that? And I think that the monastic background, we can learn a lot by learning from both the mistakes as well as the successes of that long story.
One of my observations of new monasticism is that these groups and the culture of it tends to be politically active, politically progressive, engaged, on one hand, much more so than more conservative church environments. Well, perhaps that's not fair. Perhaps there are conservative church environments who are politically active in other directions. But there's a political, progressive kind of energy there. But then also there's a sort of real religious orthodoxy, in fact, because it's really, that movement in particular is very much drawing on lots of Christian tradition that tends to be, mostly probably much older than, the Protestant story. So it has this kind of orthodoxy, this balance between a sort of spine of tradition that seems to enable it to occupy a slightly more dangerous place in the world, or a posture that is welcoming of change, or bravely engaging with it and wanting to see good new things happen rather than be forever rehashing the old things. I'm also interested in the moments that produce something like a religious, Catholic religious order or something analogous. I imagine that often it's a time when there is some puzzle, some friction to be reacted to, or a possible solution to some kind of stuckness. And I think times of great change, times of great transition, when everything's up in the air and the structure of things and the future shape of things is all quite unknown, can be quite a generative time. In terms of producing new groups saying, maybe we'll do it like this, or shall we try it like this, or what if we were all to commit to doing this or to not doing that. I'm wondering if you sense that going on at the moment within your realm.
Oh, very much so. The words that come to my mind as listening to you describing this sort of particular focus is dynamic, as opposed to static. So there's a tendency in all of us, I think, humanly speaking, to sort of like value a little bit of being static. It's we don't want to be constantly sort of changed. On the other hand, if that takes over, it deadens. So you want the dynamism. But the dynamism focused on something that is real. So is it focused on an internal, how do we preserve ourselves? Well, that is a dynamism, but it's not necessarily a productive dynamism. It's one that sort of risks sort of going inwards on a sort of a navel-gazing sort of program. So it's finding how do you maintain what is essential and keeps the focus, keeps the structure there. How do you encourage, we're back to undertaker and midwife, how do we encourage the dynamism, and how do we keep it focused on something that is beyond ourselves? Are we prepared to continue to ask questions which don't just protect our own sense of self-security, but which open us up to that other presence. And I think that is at the heart of what I believe the Christian journey is about, and I would want it to be that way. But it's easy saying that. It's another matter actually living it through and negotiating it and encouraging one another to come on board and recognise those. And I think that perhaps one of the things that's missing very often is the opportunity to sit down and really listen to one another. And I don't mean just long listening, but have a dialogue like you and I are having now. There's a dynamic tension which is good, because that can then help me to see better something that I'm missing because I'm listening to you, and hopefully the other way around. And that doesn't always happen, because the big danger in groups, whether monastic or otherwise, is that it closes in on itself, becomes self-protective, and in that sense becomes a straitjacket. So I wouldn't want to canonize, aren't monastic groups great? Well, which ones are we talking about?
Yeah. One of the tensions that it's notable to me that you've named it almost every time it's become apparent that it's in the room is gender. So when I think of Catholic religious orders, I mean it's a question of Catholic hierarchy as well as in so many other kinds of churches. I mean the Passionists. I assume you have to be a man to be of the Passionist order. Are there religious orders that are all women? Are there religious orders that are mixed groups? I'm interested in those kinds of dynamics.
Well, first of all, there are women groups that would would be Passionist. There's one religious order very closely associated with us called the Cross and Passion Sisters, and they come out of the same stable. Their foundress in this country is buried alongside the man who started us in England, buried together in St Helens, Elizabeth Prout. There's other religious orders of women that are also call themselves Passionists, but they're more contemplative. They are nuns. They like you distinguish between sisters and nuns. I know that's terminology, but the nuns would usually be the contemplative ones, and the sisters would be the ones that would be working in schools or hospitals or whatever. So yes, there are, but also, for instance, we've had a very successful retreat centre up in the northeast of England called Minstrakers, and Minstrakers wouldn't still be going if it hadn't become a mixed community, as it has become now, that there's men and women living in the community. Each sort of out of their, some of them are married, some of them are religious, some of them are Passionists, some of them are not. But that's on a particular situation that I'm describing. Generally, I think it'll be a much bigger shift to see how this new monasticism, the new way of moving forward, in fact develops, perhaps internationally, so that there could be a much greater freedom, as everybody doesn't have to necessarily live under the same roof to belong to a particular group, for instance.
Yes, I think fluidity and flexibility is part of what is so attractive about the alternative structures to hold faithful life, I guess.
The dilemma, of course, it brings is how do you keep the flexibility and the fluidity, but also encourage a continuity that isn't contradictory.
Yeah,
it comes back to the two. It's a balance.
Which makes me think of the sort of house church movement of evangelical history, which tended to be very short-lived.
Yes, that'd be
very sort of dominated by powerful men's voices, and sort of everybody crawls out of it. Coming off better or worse.
Yeah, sort of bruised.